All right, so before I begin tonight, I have a disclaimer. Like Eloise said, I work here I don't know if she said that, but I put that in here. I work in Connection Kids. And so most of the time when I speak to a group, they're 3 years old. And I'm reading their Bible story and telling them to keep their hands to themselves or to put on their listening ears. And so big people aren't my comfort zone. And so I apologize in advance if I sound nervous because I am. But when we teach back there, we teach the kids that God can help us do big things. And so if I'm teaching that, I need to live it out. So let me take you back to August of 2022, the beginning of the most recent chapter of my life. Jens and I were just sitting down for supper, and the phone rang. It was our neighbor letting us know that the rental house at the front of our property was on fire. We had brought 2 old buildings to our land and we're putting them together to make a rental house. And we had put a lot of hours into this. And of course, it was old wood. So we knew as soon as we saw it that it was going to be a complete loss. While we were standing out there at the road watching the firemen clean up, Pastor Curtis had come and Eloise's husband had been on duty and he had responded. So the guys were standing out there talking and I was just kind of eavesdropping. And what struck me as unusual was that they weren't talking about the fire. They weren't talking about how we were going to clean up, what we were going to do next. They were talking about Ukraine. See, in February of that same year, the war had escalated in Ukraine. Russia had done a major invasion. And my husband had contacts in Ukraine. He had lived in Ukraine when he was late teens, early 20s. So he knew some people there. And they had talked to him about the possibility of what the needs were and getting involved there. And we had some conversations, but I wasn't real serious about it. But I found out that night that my husband was really seriously considering what he thought God was calling us to do. And that night I remember walking back the lane. I was still reeling from the fire. And I was telling God, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I can't do this. And our boys, we had just gotten them through high school, and they were launching out on their own. And I was ready for some quiet chapters in my life. But God had different ideas. Over the next few weeks, God really began working on my heart. And one of the ways he did that was through the song New Wine. And I have the lyrics to that song and another song I'm going to mention later on your table. But the song New Wine was a song I always liked. I enjoyed singing it here at church. But God began asking me, do you really mean what those lyrics say when you sing that song? The song talks about the crushing. It talks about the pressing. It talks about God plowing in our hearts and using hard seasons to make something new. God reminded me I had a choice. I could surrender or I could resist what he was calling us to do. God also showed me something else very clearly. He loves the people in Ukraine as much as he loves me. They didn't choose where they were born. I didn't choose where I was born. They happened to land in a country that would end up in war. I was born in the United States of America that's relatively quiet, and we have wealth. So as I continued to wrestle with that, God began reminding me of other seasons and chapters in my life where he had been faithful, where he had been guiding and sustaining us through things that I never would have chosen to go through. And that's the story I want to share with you tonight. My story starts back in 1973. I was the youngest of 2 girls. My parents had struggled with infertility. They waited 6 years for my sister and another 13 years before I came along. And later I found out that they were actually considering adoption when my mom became pregnant with me. And over the years, when I struggled with low self-esteem, I remember what Psalm 139, 13 and 14 says. For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. My parents had prayed for many years for me, and God had made me just the way he wanted. I still have insecurities, and I know many of us struggle with that, but I'm learning to embrace the unique gifts he's given me. I grew up in a Mennonite family on a small dairy farm in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Chocolate Town, USA. And for those who aren't familiar with Mennonite, they're somewhat similar to Amish, not as conservative. We did drive cars and we did have electricity, but we did not have a TV. I was not allowed to wear pants until I was in high school, and then I kind of did it even though I wasn't supposed to. So it was very much a rules environment, but also you learned a good, strong work ethic, and you learned about community. And I grew up in a wonderful family. My parents were great. They just exuded joy and love and service for all of their life. But my dad was a deacon in the church, and so we were very involved. We were there pretty much every time the door was open. We were usually the ones opening the doors and closing the doors after services. So I knew my Bible. I knew about God. But because my dad was a leader in the church, I also knew the messy side of church. I knew the politics. I knew the expectations and the pressures of needing to measure up, especially when you have to sit up front with your dad and everybody's watching you. And the other part of it was that in that church culture, usually your confession of faith came during evangelistic meetings. The preacher would preach, we usually had like week-long meetings in the spring and fall. And the preacher would come and preach, and you were expected, like when they played Just As I Am, you would put your hand up or you would walk front and say that you wanted to become a Christian. Well, I'm an introvert. I'm not putting my hand up and drawing attention to myself. So I wasn't going to do that. And the other part of that was that the evangelist usually came over to our house for meals, and my parents let them know that I wasn't a Christian. And our church is not very big, and so, of course, I felt like I was singled out, like, whenever they were there speaking. And there's a little bit of stubbornness in me, and I wasn't going to do it. But God has his way of getting a hold of us. And in 1988, there was another one of the prophetic Christ return prophecy, end time prophecy came out. And it was 88 reasons why Christ was going to come back in 88. And so my parents talked to me again, and I was skeptical. I was pretty sure if this guy was prophesying it, it wasn't going to happen. But I also knew I wanted to go to heaven. And so I figured if he was right, I probably should become a Christian. And so one night in my parents' bedroom, I prayed and I asked Jesus into my life. And to be honest, it wasn't really a dramatic change for me. It was kind of more of a life insurance policy because I knew I wanted to go to heaven. But after my junior year of high school, I went on a mission trip to Honduras. And that experience opened my eyes to a world beyond my own. After graduation, I went on an 11-month mission team and spent 9 months in Mexico City. We lived about 2 blocks from the garbage dump, and we spent our time working with the children and families that lived near the dump and basically dug through the garbage. During this time, and probably even still today, I was quiet and introverted. I didn't say a whole lot in English, and now I'm in a country where I need to speak a second language. And even though I understood Spanish, I didn't have the confidence to speak it. And I remember distinctly the pastor telling our team leader that he didn't understand why Rachel was here. He didn't feel like I had anything to contribute to the team and felt like I was just taking up resources. And that was a really hard time for me. I really began to question why God had made me the way he had. And I really began to think he made a mistake and wasn't sure that I had anything to contribute to our team or to life in general. But during that time, God anchored me in Scripture. And one verse that meant a lot to me then and still continues to today is 1 Peter 3:4. Your beauty should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which are of great worth in God's sight. One night when I was especially discouraged, I was standing on the balcony of our house, and I was looking out over the city and kind of the mountain in the distance. And the lights formed the shape of an airplane. And God gently asked me, which direction is that plane going? I realized it was pointing towards Mexico City and the airport, not towards home. And that was God's way of reminding me that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That season also helped to clarify what I should pursue in college. As part of our outreach, I was tutoring a teenage girl that had some learning delays. And we spent weeks working on the alphabet. And every night we started over at the beginning. And honestly, I don't think we ever got to the end of the alphabet. And the other people on my team began asking me or noticing that they're like, Rachel, you have a lot of patience, like that you can keep working with this girl because we would have been gone long ago. And I realized that patience was something that God had given me to use to serve others. So I came home and I pursued a degree in social work and began working in long-term care. And it's just interesting the way God weaves things together. During my high school years, my grandparents lived with us for about a year and a half. And it wasn't an easy time. It wasn't a fun time. But that was part of my preparation. And as a child, I would spend hours going with my parents to visit the elderly in our church. And I had tons of grandparents. And again, that was all part of God's plan. In my job, I loved working with residents with dementia. And I began to see that my gentle and quiet spirit, God had given that to me as a strength and not as a weakness. Because when you're working with residents with dementia, that's what you need. In my mid-20s, I honestly thought I was going to remain single. Meeting new people, especially guys, was not easy for me. So to fill my time, I threw myself into all kinds of volunteer opportunities. So I started attending a church in the inner city and began to work with different ministries in the inner city. And that's where I met Jens. Up to this point, I was still living in an apartment attached to the farmhouse where I grew up. And so I was like 40 miles from, or minutes from where the church was. And I decided I wanted to move closer. Well, Jens helped me to move. And I realized later he had ulterior motives, because a week later he asked me out, and 5 months later we were engaged. And kind of as a side note, he knew that I loved jigsaw puzzles, and so he carved my proposal in wood and then cut it apart as a puzzle for me to put together. And so that was sweet. We got married in September of 2000, and a year into our marriage, we started talking about serving together before we started our family. So in September of 2001, we went on a camping trip in northern Pennsylvania. And during that time, 9/11 happened. That night, we were sitting around the campfire, just a few hours from New York City, where a lot of it was happening. And we realized that God wanted us to give a portion of our lives to serve others. I took a leave from my job, and Jens quit his job. And we served for 6 months with Mennonite Disaster Service. And that's an organization that's very similar to Samaritan's Purse. They go in after disasters and help with cleanup. So we spent part of that time in West Virginia and part of it in Houston, helping people, basically leading the projects of the volunteers that were coming to serve. And it was a really good time for us. It was a good way for us to start out our marriage. And it really taught us that we wanted service to be an important part of our family. When we returned home, Jens was diagnosed with Chiari malformation, and he needed surgery. And basically, this is where they put a mesh in where your brainstem and your spinal cord come together, because his spinal cord was putting pressure on his brainstem. And he had been having a lot of pain for years, and we finally figured out what it was. When we went into this surgery, we knew we were expecting. But a week and a half later, while he was still loopy on pain meds, we went for an ultrasound and found out we were having twins. So our boys were born at 31 weeks, and they spent 3 weeks in the NICU. And that year was rough, between the surgeries and just all the financial stuff, and then some of the health stuff that the boys had early on. It was a hard year, but it was also a year where God carried us and where he brought our church community around us. When our boys were 3, we realized that the church we were a part of at that time wasn't where we wanted to raise them. There was some changes going on, and we decided we needed to look for a new church. And it was during that time that God began to shift my understanding of church and of service. We started attending this church. It was a large church. We decided we're going to go and we're going to sit in the balcony and we're just going to be for a while. We were just exhausted, both from being involved in church and also from just the first 3 years with the boys. But a few weeks in, the church started a building campaign for their children's wing. And they showed a clip from the Titanic of the lifeboat and of them pulling people out of the water. And they began to talk about the church's responsibility to reach people one person at a time, one child at a time. And that in a lifeboat, you don't just hang out like on a cruise ship. In a lifeboat, you're involved. You're trying to do whatever you can to pull people out of the water. And up to this point, yes, I had served in church. That was my life. But I was serving out of obligation. I came out of a works background. And so if there was needs to fill in the church, you served and you filled those needs. And that's why you did it. But this was life-changing for me. Because suddenly I was serving because God was inviting me to be a part of the team. He was inviting me to be a part of what he was doing, bringing people to Christ. So Jens and I looked at each other and we're like, we're in. So at that point we were attending Saturday nights. So we started serving in the 2-year-old room on Saturday nights. And let me tell you, 15 2-year-olds at 4:30 and 6:30, test your faith. But it was still the funnest part of our week. We actually loved it. I mean, we would kind of plan our vacations around so that we could be home on Saturday night to go serve because we couldn't wait to hear what God was doing and the life change because that church was very good about talking about bringing their team together and saying, hey, this is what happened this week. These are the testimonies from the week. And it just filled us up. And it's like, we want to come back. We want to do this more. As our boys entered school, one of our sons started complaining of constant headaches. And we had known from little on that we knew there was something going on, but he couldn't really obviously articulate it. We didn't know what was going on. But as he was getting older, he was beginning to be able to explain to us. We saw multiple neurologists and tried countless treatments. And a lot of them made things worse instead of better. And there were moments where I didn't know that I could be the mom that my boys needed. We were getting a lot of unsolicited advice from people and a lot of, from teachers and other people and pretty much telling us we were bad parents, that we didn't know how to discipline our kids, that we didn't know what we were doing. And we didn't, but we were doing the best that we could with what we knew. During one of the challenging times, and again, this is part of the story that is not all mine to share, and so there's a lot more I could share from this chapter of my life. But my son knows I'm sharing this part. There was one day we came back from a walk, and he was on a medication at that point that was supposed to help with migraines, but also is used for mental health, and it was having an adverse effect on his mental health. And we got back from the walk, and instead of going into our house, he took off running. And we lived in the inner city, East Coast inner city, row houses, narrow alleys. And of course, the boys are only like 6 or so at the time. And I have twins, so I've got to figure out what to do with the other kid. So I told him, go in the yard, do not leave the yard, no matter what. And I took off after him. And I remember being on the phone with my husband and just crying out to God because I didn't know what to do because there was times where I couldn't see him. But I kept following him. And to be honest, I don't remember how it all ended. I know I found him. I know I brought him home. And sometimes I think God allows us to block some of those things out to protect our hearts. But I do remember that even in the midst of the anxiety, I felt God's peace because I knew that he was sovereign and that he still loved my kids more than I did. Eventually, with the diagnosis that we had at the time, as we were talking with doctors, we decided that moving to a drier climate might help him. And so in 2014, we moved to the Texas Panhandle. And you may ask how we got here. A year before, or the summer before, my husband had been Googling online dry climates. He came up with like Arizona and some of those places, and we said, we can't afford to live there. And so he found the Texas Panhandle. We came and visited in 2013, and in 2014, spring of 2014, we moved here. He had come out a few months before and bought land, so I hadn't even seen the land that we owned. We moved here. We didn't have any jobs. We didn't have a house. And we didn't know anybody except the realtor. So it was a time where we really had to rely on God because there wasn't anybody else. We lived in our travel trailer for several years while we built our house. It wasn't easy, but God soon provided both a homeschool community and a church community to surround us. But often during that journey, Jens and I would look at each other and go, I wonder what God's preparing us for. And I admit, this is kind of an aside too, I admit as I wrote this, it sounds like my life was awful, and it wasn't. There's often when we talk of our testimonies, we share the challenging and the hard parts because that's where God molds us the most. But these years were fun. I mean, we built our house together, the boys and my husband and I, and so there are very many fun and good memories out of that. But we did homeschool our boys, and Jen started a business, and life was kind of settling down. But then the war escalated, the rental house burned, and Jens began taking trips to the Ukraine. What we hoped would be a short war has lasted and stretched on for 4 years, and doesn't look like there's an end in sight right now. During this time, Jens has made 11 trips, working alongside pastors, distributing humanitarian aid, rescuing people from frontline villages, and standing with people under the weight of war. I have been on the home front, many times fighting anxiety and reminding myself to breathe. Over time, it became clear that God was asking more of us than before. What had once been a part-time commitment or involvement was now becoming a full-time calling. So once again, we're taking a step of faith. This new chapter is just as scary at times, but I'm leaning on Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. About a month ago, Jen's got an urgent text from the pastor he works with. Russia's main objective this winter has been to knock out power in Ukraine, and they've been very successful. A large portion of the country probably only has power 2 hours a day. They try to schedule it when it is. They try to do rolling blackouts, but it's not dependable. So they may get power at 2 in the morning, and so that's when they need to take their showers, cook their meals, do their laundry, all of that stuff. And it's winter. It was winter then. It's warming up a little bit now, but it was winter then. People were freezing. You would see pictures come out of apartment buildings with waterfalls or frozen ice, basically, down the stairwells from broken pipes and everything freezing. And the church has been strong. They've been working to have open their buildings to be warming stations, and also to provide charging places for people to come charge their phones so they can stay in contact with each other. They've been doing this with generators, but with the cost of fuel going up, this is starting to become cost prohibitive for them. And so they were asking for battery banks or battery systems so that the churches could continue to provide this to the community. Well, once again, our journey had prepared us for this. You see, when we built our house, we decided to go off-grid for various reasons. I've questioned the sanity of that many times. You learn to live differently when you are living on solar. You can't do things when you want to necessarily because your batteries may not have enough life in them at that point. And we've learned a lot about generators, inverters, and all of that fun stuff. Well, that was what is needed right now. And so as a result, my husband has a lot of knowledge that was needed. God opened doors. The funds came in for this project very quickly. It ended up being a quick turnaround. Basically, he had about 3 weeks that we had to turn around for this trip. And so tomorrow, Jens is going into the Ukraine with a van load of supplies to take to various churches in various cities. He'll be going from city to city and church to church, setting up the battery systems in the churches and explaining to them how to use it and what they can do with them. And while he's doing that, there will be air raid sirens. Missiles and drones will be flying overhead, and he'll be hearing the explosions. He doesn't tell me everything, which is good, but I know enough. He told me the one city they're staying in, the pastor has told them probably not to stay in hotels because hotels are not safe anymore. And a number of the hotels that he has stayed at in the past have since been hit. I don't know that I'll be able to talk to him every day. He's usually, in past trips, he's done really great. He usually calls me before he goes to bed at night. But with the power situation, what it is this time, we're not sure that that's going to be possible. And so once again, I need to surrender. I need to trust God and know that he is sovereign and he has a plan. Recently, I put together a music playlist that I call The Why. And I listen to it whenever I need to remind myself of why we're going to Ukraine. The song that's been challenging me most in this season is called Deep Dive. And the lines that have been hitting me the most are, show me what's breaking your heart, even if it messes me up. I don't want to know you in part. And I don't want a surface relationship. I want more than this. And when we begin to seek that deeper relationship, it's not always fun and easy. Often God reveals the truth of the ugliness in our hearts and lives. But in spite of our mistakes, he wants to awaken the desire to be a part of what he is doing in the world. At times, people will comment to us that Jen has a special calling, or that you guys must have deep faith. To be honest, if you guys heard the thoughts going through my head, you'd really wonder why God chose us. Because there are many days where I am Jonah. There are many days when I am the disciples going, okay, but what about them? Why don't they have to suffer? There's many days where I'm going, God, this isn't fair. I throw my pity parties. I have my panic attacks. So my response is no, it's not a special calling. We all have a calling from God to use the gifts that he's given us. None of those callings are more special than any other. He wants to use all of us. 1 Corinthians 12 is very clear about that. But as Pastor Curtis has been telling us in recent weeks, we need to make time to listen to God and to hear what he's calling us to do. And then we have a choice how we respond to the Holy Spirit and what he's prompting us to do. No, he doesn't call us all to the war zone, thankfully. But what he asks of us may require an equal level of faith and sacrifice. To be honest, I probably lost more sleep about coming up here and sharing my testimony than I did about this trip for Jen's to the Ukraine. That'll probably change in the next few days, but... So tonight, I want to challenge you to look at your own story. Where in your journey have you seen God lead and guide you? What parts of your story, good or bad, have prepared you to impact others around you? Are there specific parts of your story that may resonate with someone who needs to hear about God's hope? The victories, the failures, the grief, the restoration, none of it is wasted. God is weaving all of those experiences together so your story can speak to someone else who is searching, hurting, or just wondering if God still sees them. Someone needs to hear how God was faithful in your life. So go tell your story. And I'm going to add on here that since I've lived 50 years, there's a lot more stories that I could tell. And actually, I'm going to share a little bit of this past couple months. Jen's decided to go full-time to the Ukraine, which means basically he's a missionary. We're living on God's paycheck right now. And so we're going to have to be fundraising to do that. And in January, we found out about a conference in Florida. And we looked at our finances and we're like, well, I don't think we can go. Well, I was working outside. Jens came out and he's like, I think we just got spam email. He's like, I got an email from our insurance company talking about the fire, the same rental house fire that happened, 4 years ago? And he said, they're saying that they're sending us a check, that they owe us money. And we're like, no, this has got to be spam. But they had the right numbers. They had all of the insurance information, and it was all right. So we contacted them, and they're like, yes, we underpaid you guys. I guess with some inflation or something, they underpaid us. I don't know that insurance companies do that, but they did, and they were paying us what they owed us plus interest. And it was about the amount that we needed to go to Florida. And so we're like, okay, God, we're going to go to Florida. And this was kind of like a fundraising boot camp to teach you how to raise your funds for missionaries. And while we were there, at that point, we thought we were still going to have to make our own nonprofit and kind of develop all of it. It was going to take time to do. But while we were there, part of what you did was you paired up with other people to practice giving your spiel. And so the one time they just told us to go high five another couple, and that's going to be your partner. Well, Jens went and high fived this couple, and it turns out that they are a couple that are working with pastors who used to be Muslim and have converted to Christianity. And these guys, so they are working in high-risk situations as well. And they began talking to us about the organization that they're working through that is basically running all their finances for them. And so they told Jens, you need to contact these guys. And so the next day we contacted them. Well, we find out that because we've been looking for this online. We were trying to search for it on the internet and weren't finding anybody. Jens called them and the guy goes, well, we're not really on the internet. We do this by referral. And so we don't take people unless you're referred to us. Well, that couple had referred us to them and talked to them about us. And this organization really has ended up being what we needed. They basically are our nonprofit. So we work for them, they work for us. And so, and the timing was perfect because Jens needed a place to run the funds through for this trip. And so it's just been neat to see how God has been putting all of those pieces together for us. But yet, I see God work all those miracles, and the next day, I'm in panic zone. So I'm still not learning it. I'm still working through it, just like everybody else. So I'm going to take a minute and pray for us, and then there's discussion questions on your table that you guys can jump into. God, thank you. Thank you for the way that you've been a part of my life and the ways that you have been so patient with me, trying to learn all the lessons that you're trying to teach me. Thank you for all the women here in this room and for all of their stories and for all of the ways that you have been faithful in their lives. God, I pray that you would help us to surrender to your gentle hand. Help us to trust you, even when we don't understand. Lead and guide our discussion tonight and give us courage to share our testimonies with those who need to hear it this week. In Jesus' name, amen.